Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jordan Carter, curator at Dia Art Foundation, and I'm thrilled to welcome you virtually for this program, this final program accompanying Camille Norment's Dia Chelsea Commission, Plexus, on view through January 7th. Today, Camille will be joined in conversation by Kathryn Yusoff, professor of Inhuman Geography at Queen Mary University of London. Their conversation will touch on various themes and lines of inquiry in their respective practices, including the instrumentalization of bodies in the Anthropocene and the intersection of feedback and ecological horror. Kathryn Yusoff researches how the inhuman and the inorganic affect our understanding of environmental change and issues of race and subjectivity. She is the author of A Billion Black Anthropocenes Are None from 2018, Supplementary Information on Geosocial Formations in the Anthropocene with Nigel Clark and e-flux, and the Inhumanities and Annals of the American Association of Geographers. Her forthcoming book, Geological Life, Inhuman Intimacies and the Geophysics of Race, addresses histories of geology and gravities of race. She received the Association of American Geographers 2022 Award for Creativity in Geography. Welcome, Kathryn. Camille Norment, our very own Camille Norment, received a BA in Comparative Literature and Art History from the University of Michigan, as well as an MFA and MA in Interactive Telecommunications from New York University. Informed by the sonic, Norman practice spans drawing, installation, performance, sculpture, sound, and video. Her work has recently been shown in solo exhibitions at the Oslo Kunstforening in Norway, the Riva and David Logan Center for the Arts at the University of Chicago, and Temple Bar Gallery and Studios in Dublin. Norman represented Norway in the 2015 Venice Biennial and has since participated in numerous others. She performs as a solo artist as well as with other musicians on select collaborative projects and with her ensemble, the Camille Norment Trio. She has also recently performed at institutions including the Munch Museum in Oslo in 2021, the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago with Hamid Drake in 2019, and yesterday evening in the Dia Chelsea Galleries in conversation with her installation Plexus. And next Friday, November 18th, Norman will also perform at the Park Avenue Armory with Craig Taborn. I should also note that the eponymous Dia publication for Plexus is now available. And Camille is also the pro-rector of research at the Oslo National Academy of the Arts. For those who need it, we have live captions available if you click the live transcript button on your screen. And before we begin the conversation, I will now pass it over to Kathryn to sort of set the stage with a brief reflection on Camille's work in the context of her research. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Jordan, and also to Zuna for making this possible. But a huge thanks to Camille for what has now become an ongoing conversation. And I certainly feel like I'm learning a lot from that conversation, and it really kind of is helping me understand aspects of kind of ideas that I've been working through. So what I thought I might do is just give you a brief introduction to some of those ideas as setting the stage for our discussion. And really to say that I've been really interested in my research in this connection between the inhuman and the inhumane. What I've kind of begin to sort of think of as the inhumanities. So this kind of idea of a parallel geology to that of the humanities and its Western construction of this kind of selected European subject as the apex of that achievement. So kind of white supremacy, but particularly through the material praxis and development of kind of particular ways of rendering materiality, and also rendering materiality as a subject form. And specifically, I mean how blackness was narrated and developed as a property form through the category of the inhuman and its kind of associative dehumanizing acts, namely in the category of person as slave, but also how Indigenous people were narrativized in relation to past geologic eras, so their property and land could be stolen. So I think these kind of legacies of colonial material histories and their material registers are still with us very much in the nowness of climate change and the Anthropocene. And those kind of many past and present enforced ecocides that are also attempted genocides of the kind of racialized poor and the people that live alongside the systematic impoverishization of environments. But what I wanted to talk to and kind of draw this in relation and conversation with is the way in which we think about inhuman memory as a kind of intimacy within often non-consensual closeness to the earth. And Camille's work has very much prompted me to think about how that might actually be considered within a kind of sonic environment, and to think about how it's possible to practice those kind of recovery of certain histories and geographies within a space. And if we think about the sort of, there's a kind of huge history of negative inhuman intimacies, of kind of body burdens, of etc. But in the kind of flesh of geology, there's also these kind of resident epistemologies of living with and in the earth that draw us back and forward into thinking about more intimate relationships with the earth and with inhuman materials. And sound knowledge can often bear better history than his master's history. And people like Edward Clisson, for example, talked about how in jazz, Black Americans had to recompose themselves, that the sonic became a space of a kind of recomposition of subjectivity. Or the late geographer Clyde Woods in Development Arrested called this practice blues epistemology, whereby he saw blues as a way of theorizing Black life in the Mississippi Delta, as a methodological repair to the erasure of Black histories, and in direct challenge to the plantation block epistemologies of Black life. So he argues that folk music was both a space of engagement with the environmental geographies of the Delta and a collective practice of collecting history and theorizing life as it was lived under conditions of environmental exposure to those very geographies. So I see this kind of in Camille's work in the ability to create an attunement to erased histories, to establish a responsive geography to the spatial matters of this place. And we're going to talk more about this in a moment, I hope. But they call up inhuman memories in the way they occupy space and subjects, how this resident feedback of the space is actually materialized through the flesh of the subjects that are in that space. And those of you that have been to the installation will know that it's a very kind of bodily as well as acoustic experience. And thinking with Camille's term of residential frequencies, we can think about sound as a kind of history and placemaking practice that actually brings these kind of histories of Chelsea, but also kind of much wider histories into that space. And I'm thinking here of the kind of, you know, some of the more obvious histories of the kind of Middle Passage in the kind of hull of the ship, but also the ways in which the geographies between here and there. I sit on the Greenwich Mean Time line. Camille and Jordan are in New York, and how our connected geographies are part of the kind of what makes the space that we are in now, but also the kind of the future spaces, the kind of register of the kind of shock forward of these material practices that are kind of mobilized within Camille's practice. So there's lots more to say, but I don't want to take up too much time of this conversation. But just to say that I think there's two kind of environmental histories two very kind of clear environmental histories being performed in this space. And one of them is around the kind of question of feedback and its kind of feed forward, and the question of environmental entropy. And the other is about resonant frequencies, how we tell a story of kind of inhuman intimacies and inhuman memories that are often under erasure.
Thank you so much for that, Kathryn. That was a beautiful reflection and a great way to start us off. I mean, maybe just to get things started, maybe Camille, it would be great to hear a bit about how you sort of approach these two galleries, these two different environments, and sort of, you know, maybe we could start with 545 and sort of, you know, this moment in which you saw the ceiling, which sort of led to sort of responding in a way that I think brought in this sort of environmental, ecological, maritime sort of histories.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much, Kathryn, for this conversation. And yes, it's wonderful that it's a way of thinking through shared interests and probing in very different terms. I think that when I was invited for this commission, of course, when I visited the space in 545, which is the slide that we see now, it was empty. And of course, what I noticed was this incredible vaulted ceiling, which for me gave me a very strong impression of a capsized ship, an upside down ship. And so immediately I felt that I could not ignore that, the meaning of the maritime in that space. For me, place, site specificity, the bodies of architecture have very poignant stories to tell. And to the extent that I can, I think it's important to involve them as collaborators in work whenever possible. So I knew that I would be trying to engage or create a conversation with various histories through the existence of that ceiling that was already there, defining that particular place. And I think also the Kathryn mentioned this phrase, feeding back, but also feeding forwards. It's not only about looking backwards, but how can we create growths into the future? And so this idea was very important in how I considered the forms that I would create to attach to the physical ceiling, but also attach and address the various histories that it was also implying.
Maybe I could just touch on that again and maybe open this up to both Camille and Kathryn. In this space, what we experience is the sound, what we're hearing is this microtonal chorus sort of rehearsing or sort of sounding inhuman frequencies, the frequencies that you map from the room itself. Mm-hmm. And so that makes me sort of think of this idea of the non-human collaborators or sounding the inhuman. I'm just curious for you both to maybe speak a little bit about sort of the power or the potential of sort of this idea of using the architecture, using these inhuman frequencies as a score for human enunciation.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So to further explain what Jordan is saying, the chorus tones are actually made up of the resonant frequencies of the space. What I did is had an acoustic map created of the space, which would tell me pretty much identify what the natural voice of that particular space is. And so in doing so, giving voice to or giving an articulation to a voice that is not necessarily listened to. So the chorus, I asked to actually sing these notes that are not found on the Western scale system, but they are actually the particular frequencies of the space itself. And I think this entanglement of the human and the non-human, I think is very important, because as Kathryn was also sharing, it's really it's explanatory of how we came to the situation of the Anthropocene that we are in now. This idea of what is living or not living, what is human and not human, and how that relates to inhuman practices. And Kathryn, you had a wonderful citation in your book, A Billion Black Anthropocene or None, that I wanted to share also from Diane Brand. The quote is, I want to go against the ground, grind it in my teeth. But most I want to plunge my hands in the stone. And I mention that because amongst the chorus, they who are singing, humming, groaning, moaning, they are also grinding their teeth. So the sound of this teeth as a symbol of the body and the experience of the inhuman practices has also been a very important part of this work.
You know, maybe you could actually elaborate on that a bit, this sort of relationship to the teeth chattering, because you made the sort of very intentional decision to add teeth grinding as part of the medium line as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. I think it was very important to make sure that anchor was very clear in the work. The experience is very meditative. It's very calming. It joins bodies to the sound, to the architecture, to each other through the sound and through the vibration. And I wanted to make sure that this very visceral reality of the bodies through these various histories was also quite sharp in the work. So I felt it was a needed additive in the work.
And it's also, I mean, so exciting for me in a sense is that it sort of performs the inhuman as this kind of site of redress, the kind of occupation of that historically very subjugating category is kind of returned in this in these voices that are not kind of, they're not overdetermined by that history. They're kind of, there's this sort of the grating of bone, which is also our kind of geologic bodies. That's part of the flesh of the body, and part of the kind of calcium kind of composite of our little earth systems that are bodies. But it's also kind of, it sort of reminds of those, you know, of those kind of legacies of treating bodies in these kind of dehumanizing, inhuman ways, but also the kind of legacy effects of that, right, in terms of epigenetics and the kind of forms of environmental histories that our bodies do carry and carry very differently. So, you know, for me, that's a really exciting sort of revoicing of the kind of inhuman histories, but in a way that sort of has this openness and exchange that doesn't recategorize. You know, we're in a time of sort of almost like those hardening of boundaries and borders and recategorization of bodies. So I think that opening up to even, and the way in which the vibration moves through your body, it reminds you that you have a body of kind of bones and flesh and kind of, you know, it's in that sense, it's sort of, it gives you the shape of your body in that space while talking to you about the histories that have long kind of, you know, make up that space, but make it also a kind of gesture to in the ceiling and the kind of, and I think in the brass histories as well. I mean, we haven't talked about kind of metals, but in that kind of history of metallurgy and kind of trumpets and sound and those kind of acoustic practices.
I think it's also touching upon various vulnerabilities that I think is very important to activate in the work as well, so that the experience, again, is not just settling in one place, but it's actively moving us through various histories and various ways of relating to the experience of the sound, physically moving through our bodies and joining us with the architecture and to the other bodies in the space as well.
And Camille, sort of the frequencies in this room are lower than in the companion gallery. And when we're hearing the voices, it almost sounds a bit like moans and groans, but, you know, it's sort of in this precarious place between almost ecstasy or grief. And there's also this sort of precarity with the wooden structural limbs that at once seem like they're collapsing or potentially, you know, coming back together. And you've spoken a little bit about, you know, with sort of our dire sort of ecological situation, that you didn't want the work to necessarily, you know, just be signaling, the apocalypse or something and doom, but wanting to also sort of position it as a possibility of regrowth, of healing, and so you could speak a little bit about that, and also that sort of relationship to feedback, if you will.
Right, exactly. I think I was thinking a lot about rhizomes and rhizomatic structures, networks, of course, but also that which lies just underneath the surface of things, and that which rises and perhaps engages in a certain period of growth. But, I was very occupied with this work, just, thinking about, what is just underneath the surface and what is surviving these ongoing tragedies that we are creating and have experienced, and thinking about this as a potentiality for growth. And so, as you're saying, Jordan, it's not just about looking backwards, but it's much more about connecting the histories to the possibilities that we have for moving forwards, and thinking about these networks and rhizomatic possibilities, and trying to imagine into what we might construct. So in this, the forms, we see collapse, but we also see growth, and we see piles of wood, ready to be formed into something new as well. So it was very important, as you say, that it's not just sitting in the sort of the dystopic past or the dystopic view of a future, but it's much more trying to engage in the possibilities of futures that we must actively construct and help to nurture into growth.
In that regard, Kathryn, it's sort of a similar cadence to some of your sort of propositions in terms of, not reversing actions, but rethinking or finding new alternatives in relationship to sort of the Anthropocene and climate change on local and global scales. How might you think of Camille's work or this practice or the possibilities of this sort of sonic engagement to sort of be an alternative engagement in this way?
Well, I think that's exactly what it does, is mobilize that kind of alternative. But also, visually, just think about the image we've got on the screen, this sort of very ordered roof, which is the kind of, does summon that kind of history of a hull. And then the kind of branching and the sort of falling down and the kind of, they're two very different kind of histories of engagements with materiality, I think, kind of being enacted just visually in terms of, and I think Camille's work is, it's offering us a kind of both a kind of deconstruction, but also something else. It's sort of prompting us not to reside in that. And that connects to some of the ways in which I've been thinking about inhuman memory as a kind of future praxis, and thinking about, particularly, scientists talk about how the Earth is, out of its zone of attraction, that we've moved into a different kind of space of kind of geophysical flows, essentially. And so that Earth that we're in now is a result of colonial practices. It's a colonial Earth. It's structured by these kind of organizations of materiality into natural resources, and often into human resources, is the kind of the sort of toxic little child of kind of natural resources, in a sense. But there's also this possibility to understand that actually uncovering some of these histories, given space to erase histories and what's grown around erased histories, because so much of our narrativization of the kind of material world is about what's done to it, or what is being done and how it's being transformed. And I think about this sort of term like the shock forward, as that's that which has been taken away. Also, environments grow around that absence, communities grow around the absence of people taken away. And there's in some ways kind of talking with and engaging with these kind of inhuman histories becomes a way to understand how to actually break down these violent categorizations that constitute just the kind of reproduction of colonial Earth. So I kind of, in the engagement with the specificities of the kind of acoustic space, and also this, a kind of the architectures that are growing towards different and, kind of speculative, they asked us to speculate in the space. And I think that's what's, visiting the space is really kind of extraordinary, because you get kind of, and you're not stuck in one narrative. There's all these kind of voices and kind of movement. And so you become very aware of being situated within a medium, and the medium is the sound, but it's also kind of an human medium, and you can't make those separations. And I think that's what is the real kind of, is very beautiful about the work to me, because it doesn't allow you to separate these things. It refuses that kind of colonial organization of both time, space, matter, inhuman, non-human, human, and that is a kind of potential to find a way out of the kind of dehumanizing environments that
Yeah, I think that's it's been very inspiring to hear you speak of the work in these terms, and I think the way that the audio was generated in both rooms constitutes another sort of layering of this idea of the living non-living in a way, because both the audio content is generative. Meaning that I collaborated with a software program that is creating the in this room 545 the composition arrangement in real time. So I can never at any moment know what's going to happen, which voice is going to come to me, or which voice is going to go to anyone, how the voices will collide and meet each other, how will it sound. And I find that incredibly inspiring in the terms that you were speaking of, Kathryn, because it also it leaves me vulnerable. But I think that vulnerability is a positive state, against this idea of control. And conversely, in 541, the other space, yes, which is a live feedback system. The sonics. I mean, this is absolutely about the negotiation of control. I mean, it's 4 live microphones and 4 speakers and generating feedback in real time. So, of course, in order for it to function, there has to be some sort of negotiation of the sound. It can't be allowed to get out of control, full chaos, complete freedom. And I think it's very interesting to think about, what does this mean in social terms? If I'm working through this in sonic terms, how does that relate to society and to ideas of democracy and this kind of word freedom that gets thrown around? So I find it a very active space for me to work with, and especially in that it leaves me vulnerable. And we had this performance last night that Jordan mentioned, and so we were performing in the space, and again, because the sound is live generated feedback, it's changing all the time. It changes if it's warmer or colder in the room, if the room has people in it or empty. So we had a rehearsal before the performance started, and we knew that as soon as the room was full with people, it would sound completely different, which it did. And so it's working with another living entity in a way. This sort of reflection of the non-living life, I think, has been a very important space for me to work with here.
Camille, since we're on 541, I think it's also interesting that you've sometimes designated these two spaces in elemental terms. Like we've talked about 545, which we were just looking at as water in a way, and 541 is fire, which brings up again this thing that we've been talking about a lot, which is this intersection of feedback and horror. And in the performance last evening, for those who were not in attendance or may not have been aware, there was an element of the performance that drew from some of the lyrics from Tulsa 1921 aria Catch the Fire, and this notion of catching the fire. And it seems like you're thinking a lot about fire in relationship to feedback, but also fire as something that is both destructive, but also potentially can be a tool of agency and something productive.
Yeah, absolutely. And the aria was actually produced for Misha Green's Lovecraft Country series, HBO series, a horror series actually, which was very much planting itself in the real horrors of American history, we should say. But the aria was taken from a Sonia Sanchez poem entitled Catch the Fire. And it's a beautiful work that speaks also of fire very much in these terms. And when I heard about it, I just immediately was so excited because this duality, this multiplicity of this incredible force of fire is something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially in relationship to feedback and agency. And so it was important it was an important addition to the performance to have this become a part of the live experience as well. Kathryn, you mentioned it in your book a few times. It's this idea of the worlds that have already ended. We speak of the Anthropocene, and it's in very universalist terms. This is something that is spoken of as a uniting force. We are all, facing this horrible future together. But that narrative, as you write so well, leaves very many vacancies of the worlds that have already ended in getting us to this point of the societies that were already mulled over, the people whose lives were lost in changes, the destruction of worlds that are not spoken as part of this narrative. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about that thought.
Well, I mean, maybe to kind of circle that back through fire, we can think about all the kind of fire suppression of Indigenous and Aboriginal communities as kind of part of, both kind of creating hunger and displacement and kind of facilitating certain forms of kind of settler colonialism, but also how, kind of working with and in fire became a kind of a site of kind of racial governance. I guess one of the things that I was interested in terms of the Anthropocene is the way we're not interested is just the kind of articulation of these environmental events as kind of whole events, and each one of them was kind of sedimented in a kind of a billion kind of black Anthropocenes that weren't told, a billion kind of brown Anthropocenes and that erasure, which sort of was the kind of very, very sort of bound in relation to kind of colonialism that produced this kind of world of and so, one of the things to think about with sound, which your work was really kind of prompting me to, is just thinking about how sound can take apart the kind of politics of the event and give us a very different relationship to feedback, to kind of to the kind of collaboration with voices and the kind of so that there's like in both your pieces, there isn't the possibility of a singular event. which is just kind of, there's no possibility of sort of controlling a singular event as a kind of, and producing it as a kind of universal. So if the Anthropocene has been kind of rendered as this something, a future event of that takes no account of its pasts, then it just reproduces that kind of settler mentality, and it continues to reproduce that world, right? So in order to intervene in that world, I think part of a reckoning with those kind of histories of erasure is absolutely crucial. My take on it is very much, you can't engage with environment until you've engaged with the kind of racial production of the environment, because the two are kind of originate together in kind of in this designation of the inhuman. So part of that is also kind of taking apart the production of the event, or what gets to stand as the event, and who gets to narrate it. And I kind of see in your work of this kind of, there is a profound sense of freedom in the sense that it's not being kind of, it's very precise acoustically, but it's also kind of it refuses that singular voice, and I find that really persuasive as a kind of, as both a practice, but also kind of the way in which it draws in these very particular spatial attention to history, while expanding that kind of sense of environment and how we might think about the environment in relation to the work.
Kathryn, you brought up something interesting by bringing up sort of the temporal dimension of the work. And I think that's particularly interesting in relationship to the bell, as we sort of call it, the entitled vessel in 541 that we're looking at now on the screen. And that, Camille, you've talked about sort of the bell as something that does sort of mark time, it sort of signals an event, but also the bell drone in a sort of different way is sort of something that sort of sounds its own return. So sort of kind of troubling that idea of sort of any sort of singular moment or singular event through the very nature of its reverberations. So I was just curious, maybe if you could talk a little bit more about time in relationship to the sonic experience here.
Yes. Well, I think, time is inherent to the sound, simply because it's a linear, it's a temporal phenomenon. But I like to think of, I think through sound as moving both forwards but also backwards in a way. So in that it's not only the linear physical waveform that's moving through space now, but perceiving it moving backwards through histories. How does it touch upon when it resonates with a certain past or pasts? What stories are captured in that reverberant space there? And so that's how I like to, it's always a matter of multi-directional time movement. And I think that's very important also to the notion of cultural psychoacoustics, as I like to call it, because, if we think of psychoacoustics as the study of the physical perception of sound in space, that's one very limited physical spatial environment. But if we expand that experience forwards and also backwards through historical space, historical time, then we are able to uncover a different set of resonances. We are able to explore various perceptions of our relationship to our various histories through the sonic as well.
I mean, one of the things that I immediately, and this is, I think, maybe also about where my thinking is that I immediately saw these two pieces together, as one being about the underground and one kind of being about the overground. And, that that there is this relationship to the kind of those underground spaces and you know, and also kind of thinking about the trumpet and the horn and the kind of and kind of that notion of blues epistemology and kind of. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that. I mean, I've been kind of thinking, you know, my work is very much about sort of, you know, in some ways overdetermined, negative, racialized undergrounds that support kind of white surfaces. And, you know, obviously Tulsa is a kind of, you know, in some ways is a manifestation of that. But there's a much different kind of opening going on in your work, I think, about, you know, that we're not drowned by song and vibration, rather we're kind of drowned in song and vibration, and it's a very different kind of effectual inhabitation in that kind of inhuman residency. So I was just wondering if you could say something about that and whether that has any resonance for you in terms of.
I think so. I like this idea of sort of the drowning in the sound, but it's also, you know, if we think of this sort of liquid, you know, this movement. I mean, the drop in this particular work here. I mean, I really took a while to try to shape a sensation of a pouring, you know, of a drop. It's almost a sonic libation in a way. So we might be drowning in the sounds, but we also are pouring it. You know, we have the chance to bathe in it as well. And I think it's always again, you know, water, like fire, is a source of life, but it's also a source of destruction. So it's often when it is a possibility for us to utilize it for positive shaping, then I think we are obligated to. I mean, this is something that we have to do. I feel that it's not enough to point to the problems without creating a discourse for the solutions or possibilities, or at least spaces to imagine them. It's incredibly important to imagine the possible futures.
In terms of possible futures, like I said, I just have one last sort of broad question for the both of you before we open it up to questions, which is, Camille, you've talked a lot about feedback, but you've also opened that up to this idea of evolutionary feedback and this sort of idea, again, of this sort of feedback going in multiple directions, both backwards and towards the future. And obviously this is in relationship to the environment as well. So I guess I'd just be curious to hear from both of you about, you know, evolutionary feedback, you know, where do we go with that?
Yeah, where do we go with that? I guess I'll take that first. The phenomena of sonic feedback itself is a type of evolution. It's hearing itself and multiplying that life sound into a new life form. So the negotiation of feedback for me is also considering these possibilities of evolution. And just like any other life form, when the environment changes, so does the evolution of that life form. And so what we are obviously facing now is what kind of environmental changes can we make, or do we need to make, in order to appropriate the type of human evolution that we need, societal evolution that might actually save us? Or is it even possible in this the current state of Homo sapiens that we are in? I mean, that's a question for me. When we see that we are, you know, hitting the same sort of cycles again and again, what will it take for us to sort of break out of these loops? It's really, I think, quite fascinating. And in the 50s, cybernetics and feedback systems were looked at by sociologists very closely in this idea of trying to look for the possibility of utopic societies based on self-learning. was it possible to create societies that would actually learn from their own mistakes, the way a sort of an evolutionary system might have it. But Kathryn, what do you have to say about this idea?
I think maybe mine kind of is always kind of attached to the entropy of evolutionary, or rather, not so much a kind of a progress narrative, but I think there's an amazing capacity in durational kind of inhabitation as a way to kind of break with some of those kind of notions of colonial time that are so normative within how we experience spaces and places and our connections to the earth. And I think that's what you bring in your work, an attunement to that, kind of an opening to that space. So I'm always kind of, just because of the historical research, that I'm always slightly resistant to an idea of kind of a script of kind of growth, or a script of, and actually I like to linger, I think, with the entropic and we talked about how feedback can never be sort of like have a clean pathway in a sense, and I think about that in terms of extraction, and like there is no clean extraction, and so in some ways kind of I always want to start, in the same ways that I want to start with the Inhumanities, I want to start with the kind of entropy as a way to maybe think about how to lessen its burden on and I appreciate, as a sound artist, you're probably going in the opposite direction of trying to reduce entropy in a sort of technical sense. But maybe somewhere in the middle of that kind of that rendering of both clean extraction and clean feedback and entropy. There's something else is kind of released that maybe displaces the normative for long enough for us to kind of imagine other kinds of possibilities and habitations. And I think that, for me, that's the kind of moment I want to linger with. And, I think that's where your work actually does kind of in lots of different ways. And I think I imagine that audiences have an incredible range of responses to the work and connections that they make in sort of both from the sort of oceanic to brass bands and all sorts of but I think that opening and that sitting with, and when we went around the gallery, everybody was sitting and lying and and there was an amazing concentration of just kind of of people letting their bodies be vulnerable to that sound and to that space. And I think, that's an extraordinary kind of moment to hold on to. That in some ways, the plans we have things to do after that, but what they look like, I'm not sure.
Thank you, Kathryn, and thank you, Camille. In terms of responses, if anyone does have questions, you can use the Q&A function. We do have one question or comment here from Asak Turunakavu Karasu. Please excuse me for butchering that. And they say, thank you for this presentation. Both of the art pieces are beautiful and profoundly moving. In many ways, in my opinion, this piece is part of an alternative dialogue about the environmental and how we approach climate change, and which I believe is equally important to get to a gentler world. The power of art, which is clearly demonstrated here, is the ability to examine darker aspects of ourselves and history in a way to grow into something stronger, more resilient, and in a way to move forward. I appreciate so much the complexity, especially using architecture, acoustics, software integration. It seems to examine a darker, more painful part of ourselves, but in a way where it encourages healing and transformation.
Wow.
It's a very
Thank
on
you.
point reflection. And let me see if we have any more questions here. Yes. From Jakuma, it's hello and hi. I'm wondering if you could speak more about the frequencies in the sculpture and the performance last night. It felt like the frequencies were perfectly in pitch with the musicians. How did you achieve that?
Yes, well, the musicians were actually in perfect pitch with the installation. That's what they had to do. So the installation really had the first say in setting the tonal space for the performance. And as I mentioned, it changed in 5 minutes, from when the space was empty or only with, the few of us to when it was full of over, 150 people or that were in there yesterday. I don't know. So in my selection of musicians and vocalists to work with, it was very important that they also were able to respond in that way. They were not so fixed to ideas of tone and sound, or even vulnerable to slipping into the sort of fixed tonal systems that we are used to hearing. So it was very important. So it was the feedback installation that set the tonal center for the performance, and the musicians and the vocalists had to follow that. I hope it answered your question well enough.
And there's another question here,
Mhm.
and I think this is for both of you in a way. How can sort of the intimacy with the inhuman inform the ways in which artists share their work and with the world?
I think kind of as Camille's work shows us, it gives us a different way to think about environments kind of plural, and kind of our relationship with the earth, with earth materials. And I think it kind of, I think this, rather than the sort of very descriptive or representative kind of, work around the earth, I think kind of, and I think that the acoustic spaces that Camille mobilizes in the work really give us a way to understand the kind of the dimensionality of environments and our kind of as bodies within other bodies and and back to you, Camille.
I think something that is very important to me as well is to find a way to place myself within states of vulnerability in a way, or unexpected, and having to sort of expect or having to receive something from the work that I did not necessarily put into it, and having to be hospitable to that, because that's also I think an important trait in how we deal with each other is just being able to be hospitable to that which is unexpected or different or not even liked, for example. So I think it's and I find that art can be a space where we're not just offering something that is sort of feeding a narrative that we want, but when we place ourselves within that space as well, then it becomes almost a different kind of practice of ethics in a way, which I think is very important for me to find various ways to explore that as well. It's easy to come up with ideas of the way the world should be, but it's much more challenging to find ways to put yourself in situations that are not always agreeable, and having to face, what does that mean? What does that mean that I'm talking about control, and yet creating a feedback system that is all about, negotiating control in real time. So it's something that makes me think, and I think that's important, very, very important.
And I think we have one last question here. It's another from ASOC, and I'm going to try and sort of summarize it. It's sort of about the healing possibilities and dimension of art. Sort of in what sense does art have an evolutionary role in sort of breaking generational trauma? Or like how can art, or how could you propose art as something that could break or sort of intervene or heal intergenerational trauma?
Yeah, that's, I mean, I think art has many possibilities. I wouldn't begin to know how to answer that so specifically, but I think it's very important to engage imaginations. I think a lot of trauma that is passed down through generations also finds itself locking out even being able to conceive of possible futures, futures as with an S. So I think anything that can open up possibilities, and so that the imagination can be engaged is I think some place where I would start first, because if you cannot imagine futures with an S, then it's very difficult to break out of what you might feel has already been prescribed to you.
Yeah, I think that sort of brings to mind Toni Morrison's kind of, you can't imagine it, you can't have it. And
Yes.
But I mean, one of the way you were just talking about ethics, Camille, and it brings to mind a sort of, if colonial Earth is sort of geo-trauma, like writ large across lots of migrant and kind of displaced communities, that kind of geoethics as kind of imagined as a kind of reimagining of that trauma and its kind of its occupation and its kind of possible futures becomes a way of thinking about the conditions under which you might make work. And I mean, I think it's something that you were talking about in terms of kind of vulnerability. So yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's a kind of long history of innovation and kind of and aesthetics as a kind of a politics to sort of descript kind of violent displacements and violent geotraumas, and part of that is relanguaging the not just relations to ourselves and relations to the earth, and I think art clearly has a kind of crucial role in giving us languages that we can imagine to exist.
Yes.
So we're at time, but a few more questions came in simultaneously, and they're kind of touching on similar sort of lines of inquiry, if you will. So I'm going to try to merge them into a question for you both that maybe we can end on. So a question from Richard Colton and also Catherine Lowry, but sort of speaks about, first, we're very thrilled to see that your two voices interplaying in this conversation. And they're curious, about a relationship between, I guess, your research, Kathryn, in terms of geology, in terms of sort of the Anthropocene, and sort of that sort of field of inquiry, and the field of inquiry of sound and art, like how might this intersection, this very sort of conversation we're having between the two of you and your two disciplines, how might that show us a path forward? Similarly, how could the inhuman lead humans to a better place? So it's sort of a similar sort of question around sort of how can this sort of conversation and this focus, this interdisciplinary sort of conversation we're having lead us to a better place?
I think conversation is key, and discourse. How can I think a lot of our work is about showing possible paths, revealing what is already there, and I think that is something that leads me to admire Kathryn's work so much, because she's showing us paths that are connecting histories to possible futures, through really uncovering very important spaces hidden nowness in a way, you know, and but not a stagnant now, but it's the now that is always moving in some direction. So, you know, how do we nudge it one way or another, you know, or, you know, push it, you know, but, you know, what kind of energies can we give it to sort of activate itself? I mean, this is something I'm very interested in now, you know, how can we create, you know, active agents in a way, you know, not just controlling, creating another system of control and pushing something in the right direction, but creating systems that will have energy to move themselves in the right direction in a way. And that's what we really need to do. And that's what I find inspiring about Kathryn's work, because it's, you know, pushing something or creating another law. It's a, you know, or a set of laws. I mean, it's a help, but it's also another sort of, it's a system that hasn't really worked so well. You know, how do we change the actual workings of our societies and our ways of engaging in each other? I think that is something that's I would like to see paths for, and that perhaps brings us and definitely touches on the inhuman and the humans, and that's it. It's a tricky one because you know artificial intelligence and feedback and cybernetics, you know, it's all related, and it's, you know, I would say proceed with caution, absolutely, because it's you know, these spaces are definitely quite fascinating, but they're also quite terrifying and dangerous, I think. And I'm not sure that we are, well, it's a whole other discussion, so I should filter, but I think letting the inhuman lead humans to a better place. I think I would, I think I would want to collapse, you know, inhuman and human into just kind of pulverize it into the atoms. I mean, you know, it really, we just need to kind of get back down to that level of equality. I think I'm not just concerned about the humans, you know, but I'm concerned about all the other matter on this earth, and I know that it's not equal, and there's so many issues that we need to grapple with on many levels, but I think it's very important to sort of break things down to the level of molecules, you know, conceptually, and build them up again and say, okay, now, you know, what kind of identities have been created in this rebuilding, you know, and where has that gone wrong? You know, how do we deconstruct that and build that up again? So I'm not saying that we can forget humanness, because we can't, and this is what we are, but we need to forget it sometimes, or at least center our humanness, you know, to remember that we are also engaged in we are molecular bodies as other non-living entities, and I think it's important to move back and forth between these perspectives. But Kathryn, I know you've spoken a lot about this.
I don't know really where to start, but maybe you know, maybe part of the kind of the trying to collapse these kind of artificial, you know, it's like we all know that there's not a human, a non-human, and an inhuman, that of course they're contiguous and kind of continuous with each other, and yet it's really hard to think against those categories, and those kind of, because they're such long historically sedimented character, and so I think thinking about them as sort of infrastructures of effect. And I think that's what your work kind of mobilizes, that have gravity, that have kind of force, and have, you know, we see socially a lot of that in terms of, you know, these sonic gravities of anti-Black and brown violence. So I think kind of, you know, in some ways, going further into the human, which may be about this kind of, you know, we talked a bit about sort of speculative sci-fi and and horror, and, you know, so like horror is one way to sort of deal with these kind of inhuman legacies, and to sort of project them into other speculative futures. But I think there's also this kind of, that kind of accommodation, when I look at the sort of the horn and the kind of, there's a kind of gathering and there's an intimacy between those two brass pieces, right? And how they talk to each other and how the kind of, microphones pick up the people in the room. And there's this kind of, amazing kind of intimate dialogue that everybody's sort of sharing in, and it's autonomous, and it's also kind of, it has a possibility to be many things. And I think kind of thinking about those kind of inhuman intimacies as a kind of possible site of just changing the relationship between bodies and how we imagine and think and understand our bodies, particularly in relation to the earth, is kind of a speculative future I'd like to see.
Well, thank you so much, Kathryn, and thank you, Camille. This has been a really rich and deep conversation. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And for those who have not yet seen or experienced Plexus, please do. The exhibition is on view, as I said, through January 7th. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Camille.
Thank you, Kathryn. Thank you. Thank you, Jordan.